How are you all, Wyrm here. The speculation and theory discussions have been going on full steam ahead ever since the Endwalker reveal. In one of my last videos, I went into detail about the Scythe as a possible weapon for this new mystery Melee DPS. However, today I want to discuss another prime candidate, something that's been discussed and dreamed of for years by the Final Fantasy XIV community. A hammer or mace wielding job. Now, as I just mentioned, many have been hoping for such a job for years. Most with the theory it would be something similar to the Warrior or the Dark Knight. But given that we are getting a Melee DPS in Endwalker, it has the community discussing the idea of a Melee DPS wielding a two-handed warhammer or mace. The discussions of a hammer or mace wielder go back even before 1.0. I still remember discussions about it in the FF14 core forums all those years ago. I spent some time researching all historic topics on the subject, and doing my own research into hammers and maces, not only in the Final Fantasy series, but in other fantasy games. Now that I have everything clear in my head, let's start breaking down all the info. First off, let's go over the history of these weapons in the Final Fantasy series. Hammers and maces are quite the common sight in most of the Final Fantasy series. In most of the games, the mace is a starting equipment, often being a player's first obtainable blunt type weapon. The hammer starts off the same, however this weapon tier received much more attention and thus has some powerful endgame options, such as Thor's hammer, also called Mjolnir depending on the game you play, and the Mithril and Gaia hammers. Out of the entire Final Fantasy series, I wish to bring your attention to two particular games for this discussion: Final Fantasies IV and XI. In Final Fantasy IV and its sequel games, the hammer is the main weapon type wielded by a number of characters. The best example of these characters is Cid Polendina, whose job is Engineer. While he can wield other weapons, the hammer is what he's best known for, and strongest of which being Thor's hammer. Now, Engineer isn't his established job in the series, it's closer to Machinist than anything else. In Cid's case, he has high physical stats, can analyse enemy stats, as well as a unique ability upgrade, which allows him to add elemental properties to his attacks. Keep that upgrade ability in your memory, I'll be bringing it up again later in the video. We move on now to our sister MMO, Final Fantasy XI. In this game, maces are classified as clubs, which is a skill category containing a number of weapons to which most of the jobs in game can wield. The hammer is the most damaging weapon type in the club skill category. However, hammers in game can only be wielded by white mages and geomancers. An interesting thought, isn't it, my fellow geomancer fans? Alright, so we've established that the hammer and mace has a history in the series, but what about an MMO like Final Fantasy XIV? Well, let's take a look at the examples of hammer and maces already in game. Maces are wielded by a great number of different enemies in game, same goes for hammers. Rather than go through a full list of these, which will honestly not get us very far, I'll be focusing on those who play a part in the main story of the game, as well as some of the endgame content. For our first example of such a weapon wielder, we need to turn back the pages of the Eorzean Encyclopedia to years ago during A Realm Reborn. Near the end of A Realm Reborn, we find ourselves storming the Praetorium to seek and destroy the Ultima weapon. As we near our goal, we engage in combat with Nero Tull Skeva, a Garlean engineer wielding a very unique weapon known as a gunhammer. Nero uses this weapon to great effect, unleashing some strong melee attacks with some potent elemental effects. After doing all my research on this subject, Nero at this stage with the gunhammer reminds me a lot of Cid in Final Fantasy IV, with a kind of combination of him and his upgrade ability in Nero's gunhammer, which would explain why he could perform some impressive feats with it. When we first encountered Nero, this was enough for many to speculate that he could be a glimpse at some future job. But I feel this weapon was just part of a wider 14th Imperial Legion gimmick that went on for all of A Realm Reborn. During the main story, we face off against multiple Garlean foes wielding a lot of, for lack of a better word, gimmicky weapons. We have Gaius' Gunblade, an impressive and established weapon, then Livia's gun gauntlets, the guy whose name I can't pronounce and won't even try with his gun shields, and finally Nero with his gunhammer. It's harder to see the gunhammer as being serious when it's mixed up in this stew of gimmicks that was more for the fans' benefit than for showing us something serious. The next prime example of hammers in Final Fantasy XIV is wielded by many crafter jobs like the blacksmith. However, it's hard to imagine a blacksmith wielding any other tool than a hammer, so let's move on from that. We now move on to the latest appearances of such hammer weapons in Shadowbringers, which was the primary case for reigniting the community's desire for such weapons. The dwarves of the first wield mithril hammers as their race's primary weapon of choice. Happily for many, this weapon became obtainable in-game and could be wielded by warriors, and they can even glamour their appearance over any axe they wield and give them that sweet hammer-wielding look. Now, on the subject of glamour really quick, this isn't the only weapon glamour that can give players a mace or hammer look on their weapons. For Dark Knights as an example, there is the Akione Great Club, which gives the sword the look of a big club which is pretty unique looking for a Dark Knight. Players can obtain this via PvP currency in the Wolves' Den. Now then, onto the latest appearance of a hammer in Final Fantasy XIV. We next encounter Gaia wielding a true two-handed hammer in Eden's Verse when we face off against Shiva. Take a look.
The light! It's too much for her to bear! Ugh, she won't last much longer! Enough of this! Power of darkness, answer my call!
Now, we are not sure what job Gaia really is, if we can even call it a job. But the fact that she wields a two-handed hammer combined with her power of darkness is something very interesting to many, and further fueled speculation on what the job could be. And that does it for these weapons appearances in Final Fantasy XIV. With the history covered, it leads us to the question the community has been asking itself for years. Could we get a hammer or mace wielding job in Final Fantasy XIV? And what job could it be? Let's go over what we know. We know the next job is going to be a Melee DPS. We also know it will share the same armor sets with a Dragoon, which is heavy armor and plate. So, looking back on the series for inspiration, what jobs fit this description? First off, we have the Viking. This is a recurring job in the Final Fantasy series. They are well known for their high physical strength stats, and is related closely to the likes of Warrior and Pirate in design. The Viking can wield hammers in many of the games it appears in, although they are mainly a tanky job. Now, why Viking for the new Melee? Its lore would make it stand apart from the other jobs we have. As recent reveals have already stated, we are heading across the seas to Thavnir, so it's not impossible we could encounter Vikings and the job art when we get there. The mental image I have of a Viking wearing plate and chainmail, wielding a big two-handed hammer, is something making Viking look like a prime candidate for the new Melee DPS. Next up we have the Templar, another recurring job in the series. I list Templar as one of my main guesses, mainly due to what we saw with Gaia and her uses of a melee weapon in combination with magic. The Templar is similar in this fashion. They wear heavy armor similar to Dragoon. They are also known to wield spears and swords, but I could see them wielding a hammer due to their stats. But what makes Templar unique, even though they have high physical stats, they can also wield potent spells, but not to the degree of a magic caster like a Black Mage, for example. I see this as a great candidate due to what I just outlined, but one issue is that the Templar is very similar to Paladin in terms of its design and lore. But this doesn't mean it's unlikely that Templar is a viable choice, but it would need some changes, as all jobs do, to fit in Final Fantasy XIV. Lastly, we have something the community has been speculating about a lot recently, even though it's not an established job in the series. The Judge. Now, the Judges are a mainstay of the Final Fantasy series, particularly in the games revolving around Ivalice. We have seen them wield a vast array of weapons in all their appearances. They wear heavy armor that's different from one judge to the next, and they can also wield spells, but for the most part are close-up melee combatants with significant strength behind them. The main reason for the judge speculation is we've been getting a lot of references to judges in recent patches, and they are sure to play a part in the upcoming Endwalker storyline from a Guardian perspective. An example of such references is the appearance of Gabranth as the head of the 4th Legion, and the new armour we get from Bosja, which is modelled after the judges we see in Final Fantasy XII. All 3 of these jobs could make a great melee DPS. However, it's just as likely we could get something entirely unexpected, or even a new unique job created for Final Fantasy XIV. Almost no one saw the Sage coming, especially with the new unique weapon, so anything is possible at this stage. But what do you all think? Could we get a hammer or mace wielding DPS, and what do you think it would look like? Get involved with the discussion by leaving a comment, and hit that like and subscribe button to support this video and keep informed about my upcoming ones. I will be doing a lore dive into a story plot point in the Endpoint expansion soon. Thanks everyone, and as always, have a good one.